Thank you. I'm going to just bring all the wonderful people up with me as well. So we've only got 20 minutes to essentially talk about the future of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and creativity, so we'll crack straight on. I'm incredibly privileged to have these three wonderful minds with me here today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because it will be a hell of a lot more authentic. I have Oscar, Kathy, and Ross. In a couple of sentences, I'm saying this particularly to you, otherwise that'll be 19 minutes of the 20. Go!
OK, try and keep it brief. My name is Oscar Sharp. I'm a film director, mainly. That would be my sort of standard bio. I work in Hollywood, writing things for film studios and that sort of thing. But this odd little side hustle emerged that then turned into like a hobby that turned into like most of my life a lot of the time. I was working with Ross Goodwin here, who is a creative technologist. He'll explain himself. And we made a movie a couple of years ago that was written by an artificial intelligence. It was the first of its kind in that regard. An artificial intelligence named Benjamin.
The movie's called Sunspring.
And the movie is called Sunspring. It's got Thomas Middleditch from Silicon Valley in it, the main guy from that show, which you might have seen, but you also might not have done. I'm getting a lot of blank looks. That's
Anyone
a little like
seen
definitely not
Sunspring?
seen it. One
There's
person has seen
There's a couple.
Sunspring.
There's one in the back as well.
Excellent.
That guy.
Good.
It's worth a watch, even if just.
It's only 10 minutes. You
Yeah.
can
Let's hijack the panel and just watch that. No? OK. Fine.
Kathy.
My name's Kathy Pearl. I work at Google as head of conversation design outreach and wrote a book designing voice user interfaces. I've been working with voice user interfaces since the early days in the 90s on phone systems, and it's just been really exciting to see how they've evolved with things like Google Home, and you can do more and more when you talk to your computer. So I think a lot about the best way to design these, so you'll actually be able to have a good and not a frustrating conversation. So it's fun for me to watch Sunspring and see how the conversation sometimes falls off the rails a little bit.
And I'm Ross Goodwin. I'm an artist who uses technology and specifically machine learning and code as my medium. I am also the creative technologist for a small program at Google called Artists in Machine Intelligence, and Oscar's collaborator, of course.
Wonderful. So I'm going to dive straight in. I'm sure everyone in the audience is here because on some level you're kind of interested in machine learning and AI. If you look right back at how it started because philosophers wanted to symbolize human thinking. So essentially humans created AI. AI is now a part of pretty much our everyday life. We come across it all the time, so it's leading humans. Humans feed back into AI. AI has derived subsets of machine learning which help humans. It becomes a virtuous cycle. So my first question to the panel is, who do you really think is actually leading the creative?
Who's leading the creative? You mean when?
Well, whether it's humans or machines?
In this world of AI and machine learning, if it's a virtuous circle of humans
That's interesting.
AI
Well,
and
so
AI humans.
I mean, we've often said, and I think it applies here, that AI is human. Mm-hmm. Certainly Benjamin, for example, our AI was trained on thousands of screenplays, formed a statistical model of them, and then output stuff which statistically is like those screenplays, which means really it's sort of reprocessed humanity, as opposed to a thing that's going, I'm creating something. What it's doing is just getting humanity and kind of reflecting it in a quite weird funhouse mirror that then myself and a bunch of actors interpreted and made into a movie.
I would go even further into the technology is very human, and to think of technology as an other is sort of becoming increasingly, I think, seen as an outdated notion, because if you think about it, I mean, we have short guts because we use cooking fires. Tools are what separate us from our primate ancestors. We take medicine, we wear glasses, we do all these things to our bodies with technology, and to think of it as being fundamentally not human, I think has always sort of been wrong in a way.
So do you think and please, like I might direct this at Kathy. Do you think machine learning is freeing up the creative process for us?
I think it can definitely have that potential. I mean, similar to what Ross was saying, I think you start with something like pen and paper. We don't think of that as anything special now, but it's the tool that allows us to put these things out there. Machine learning can be just a more advanced tool that allows us to put more and new ideas into it and see what interesting stuff comes out, tweak it, try again. So at the moment, yeah, I definitely see it more as a tool than sort of taking over or becoming its own sentient being or anything like that.
Pretty much every technology we've constructed is a tool that's an extension of our will. Like, we didn't want to punch rocks, so we invented hammers. I think that every time we do it, it's because there's a thing we'd like to do. And certainly when we built Benjamin, we wanted to do this thing where we were like, wow, if you could process like all these screenplays and find out what the patterns were that emerged on their own without you having to kind of use your own biases to interpret them, what would you find out? What would you find out about human writing? And we found out some stuff.
I thought one of the interesting patterns was that the characters often say to each other, "What do you mean?"
Yeah, and I don't know. And our theory on that is that in science fiction, which the machine learning model was trained on science fiction screenplays, you have a lot of instances of characters trying to understand their environments.
Yeah.
Or in an unknown environment that they're trying to get their head around. I don't know is also an answer that you can provide to any question, and it will make sense in English.
Yes.
So it's an obvious catch-all as a machine answer for anything.
What do you mean? Sorry, they also often say, what do you mean?
Yeah.
And actually, as a screenwriter in my other life, I notice it's not even only science fiction, is that a lot of the times as a screenwriter, you're trying to find ways to cause characters to do exposition because you just need to explain stuff to the audience. So you're finding a lot of excuses for that, and then Benjamin finds the shortcuts.
But here it never gets explained.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, no.
And so what are we learning from this process at the moment? What do you think machine learning is teaching us as creatives?
I mean, we found out quite a few things. One of the fun parts has been, if you get Benjamin output, you can do statistics on that and learn some stuff. So Benjamin, every day on Facebook, publishes a film synopsis, writes a title and then a little paragraph for a movie pitch. There's some pretty weird ones in there.
It's a good coffee break if you get 5 minutes.
It's
some
a
really
fun little read.
Odd,
but if you get like hundreds of thousands of those, which Benjamin can write in 30 seconds, and you do like a concordance on them, you learn some stuff because it's trained on like all of the film synopses that we could find on the internet, right? And we found out, for example, that men are mentioned 4 times more often than women. Fathers 4 times more often than mothers. Sons 4 times more often than daughters, although further and further down in the statistical breakdown. The most common phrase in film synopses from the internet, as interpreted by Benjamin, is a young man in a small town.
That's really interesting.
So if you want to write a Hollywood movie, start with a young man in a small town. Make it slightly longer, and it's a young man in a small town is stuck, or trying to, or forced to.
And so do you think that there will come a point where we won't need to write stories anymore as humans? Is machine learning going to get there for us?
No. Sorry. I don't think so. No. Because, it's about finding new interfaces and new methodologies for writing more than it is about like replacing the act of writing. I mean, to the extent that writing is a fundamentally human activity, humans will always be doing it. The ways in which we write might change. I mean, just like the invention of the camera took something, the creation of a photorealistic image that once took years of training and innate talent as a painter to produce and put that in the hands of a much broader audience. We think machine learning, has the capacity to do things like create cameras for writing. You might be writing with an instrument that produces an entire block of text at once instead of writing word by word or letter by letter.
One of the things I find the most interesting about watching Sunspring is that because the actors do this great job, and because we're biased to think that when people are talking that they're making sense, so you're watching these actors and they're putting all this great emotion and facial expressions, and your brain is like, this makes sense, but then you're listening to the words and you're like, it doesn't make sense. And it's very, this contrast where it feels like it really makes sense, but it doesn't actually, and I find that fascinating.
Sounds like quite a lot of conversations I've had here at the Camline.
And so the biggest thing at the moment, I think, is voice. And like everybody's talking about this sort of next evolution of how we are interfacing with artificial intelligence, assistants. Voice is a really, really personal thing. I'm going to direct this to you because you're our expert in voice on the panel. But do you think we're crossing a boundary when we bring such a personal element into this at all?
Crossing a boundary that we shouldn't cross, or just are we crossing a boundary at all?
Have we removed an aspect of the personal side of things, or stepped into perhaps something where we're converging a little bit, where the technology and the human bit ends?
I think, the great thing about voice is that it's just so natural, and so right now to learn a new technology, it used to be you had to read the user manual, you had to fiddle with your gadget or whatever, and now you can just talk to it. And what could be easier than that? And I think it's just a means to an end. by taking advantage of the fact that we've all been speaking since we were very young, we know how to do it. If our computers can learn our language rather than us learning theirs, it just becomes a great tool. I mean, there may be a day long in the future where they become whatever, self-aware in their own things, but we're a long way out from that. So in the meantime, just think it's a great tool.
Okay. And so I'm going to ask each of you to answer this in as close to 30 seconds as you can.
Oh, God.
What's your favorite AI-led piece of content, film, or campaign?
Sunspring.
Well, actually, no, you can't say that. I was hoping you wouldn't say that.
This week it's Zone Out, because Benjamin has made 2 more films. Last year it was It's No Game. David Hasselhoff trained on David Hasselhoff's
so you
past
put yourself
performances.
forward for this.
And this year, Zone Out, Benjamin wrote, directed, scored, and performed the movie, which is incredibly weird this time.
I watched that. It was very weird.
Yeah, it's sitting on YouTube now. But yeah, I mean, why would I not pick the thing that our own creation built? It's not my work, it's Benjamin's. I'm
of course.
myself up.
This is a tricky question. I can't think of that many, but one I'll pick, which is actually a fake AI led. Had anyone seen the one about Olive Garden commercials?
Yeah.
So somebody said they trained their bot to watch 1,000 hours of Olive Garden commercials and then made a new script. It was not true. The guy made it himself, but or actually, I don't know if it's a man or a woman. Anyway, it's hilarious, and it feels like it was written by an AI, although it was not.
So we've had a few conversations about this particular example this week, and one of the things that I've talked to folks in the chatbot industry and in the creative AI space about is how that particular instance of this Olive Garden thing going viral, even though it was fake, it sort of proves that this concept of bot-generated text has really gone mainstream, and people have a sense for what the tone is and what the style is that bots have, when they're sort of left to their own devices. The example that I was going to bring up is Botnik Studios. They're doing stuff similar to the Olive Garden thing, but actually, cheating slightly less, I guess. What they're using, I wouldn't even call AI. They're using basically an autocomplete tool, selectively picking the next word over and over again to generate interesting, remixes of existing content. And they were pretty well known for that fake Harry Potter book they published like a few months ago. And they have projects coming out all the time. Good friends of mine. And
yeah, it is fantastic stuff.
And
I do think this familiarity of the Olive Garden piece and so on, it speaks to what they and we and a lot of other practitioners in this field have been trying to do. We want people to become more familiar with this feeling of like, oh, a kind of a robot wrote this, and it's got this particular oddness to it. And when you speak to the subject of like natural voices and whether when they get too natural that they fool you, whether something problematic is happening, I think that our ways of communicating, let's say vocally, have always been a means of sort of connecting ourselves as a species. They've always been a way of understanding each other. And of course, that's what a filmmaker is doing when they make a conventional film. They want to form a connection. So the notion that you're forming a connection with something that then you find out that there's no someone there is what's so deeply uncanny. And we're trying to say, well, there is something uncanny to that, but a person still made the thing that made the output.
Yep.
And in a way, you're connecting with those artists, and you're connecting with them in a different way.
And that's really interesting. I'm going to pick up on that theme of connecting, because I think as creatives, there are 2 uniquely human things that go into a creative output. There's the slightly batshit crazy process that we go through of actually coming up with the idea, following it through, and then there's the emotion, like the human emotion that goes into it, whether we're trying to make someone laugh or cry. Machine learning's kind of got to a point where it can almost begin to trick us that it's feeling. Do you think it will ever really get there, or is it just going to become exponentially better at mimicry?
I think that there's a big problem with the way that we frame these questions in general, which is that the vocabulary we use is very anthropocentric, meaning it is vocabulary that is applied exclusively or has been applied exclusively to human activities and human thought. And the fact of the matter is that to the extent that machines can emulate us or emulate human activities, or activities previously thought to be exclusive to humans, they're doing it quite differently. There's this famous Dijkstra quote that it basically goes, the question of whether a machine can think is about as relevant as the question of whether a submarine can swim. And I think that's very telling, and you can basically replace the word submarine and swim with feel and any other word that is really exclusive for humans, because I think what we really need is like a new language and new vocabulary to talk about these issues and describe what bots are doing, because otherwise we risk anthropomorphizing, we risk confusing what's happening and misunderstanding our own technology and not really actually letting it reach its true potential.
And I think whether they become emotional and have their own emotions or not is an interesting question that we won't know for a while. But to me, also really important is our emotional response to them. So I'm thinking about things like the robot dog from Boston Dynamics in that video where they're kicking the dog. It's upsetting, even though this is just a robot dog. Who cares? And when you see someone yelling at their voice assistant, they're not hurting the feelings of the voice assistant, but it tells you a lot about that person, about how they treat others. So I think our reaction is very important to think about as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've been anthropomorphizing as a way of understanding ourselves for as long as we've been a species, in a way. We create puppets, we use rocks, and we go, once upon a time, Mr. Rock was angry with Mrs. Rock, and we sort of bang them together. There are very base instincts in us to understand ourselves through this process. And so, of course, we do it with our technologies, especially those that lend themselves to anthropomorphization very readily. And I don't know that is always automatically a problem. One of the things that we're doing in our work is we're going, hey, it called itself Benjamin, which it did, and then people are drawn to it like, oh, is it a person then? Can I learn? And they're leaning into it. It's like, what can I learn about humanity this way is the sort of unconscious drive of that. And then we're putting up our hands going, guys, it's basically a hammer. Right? It's basically something that we built that's very complicated that does this tool action. So please remember when you're looking at it that you're understanding yourself in a complex mirror as opposed to empathizing with a someone.
But we both think it's important to sort of create the illusion before we bring it down, in order to properly communicate that.
Yes.
And how do you think our relationship is going to change with Google Assistant and Siri in the next couple of years?
I think it's going to get a lot more personal, and you're going to have it from when you were small to when you are big. So it's going to learn a whole bunch about you as you interact with it every day, things you like, when you're in a bad mood. And it might come to the point where it's so easy to talk to your virtual assistant. I hope that people don't not want to talk to people, because the virtual assistant's like, oh, it's so easy they know me so well, they'll never tell me I'm wrong or whatever like that.
Humans.
But I think it's going to become very personal. It's going to know a lot about you, which, if we do a good job, can be a really nice thing.
Do you think we'll ever have a moment where those assistants become versions of ourselves?
There's another philosophy there. There's, for example, that bot replica where you train it it asks you questions about yourself, and it starts to mirror you, which is another fascinating way to look at it. We might have different versions of ourselves as assistants that we send out in the world to do various tasks for us. That could be interesting.
The one thing that excites me about, because I do find that exciting, but it also concerns me in certain ways, because when you have a system that's collecting so much personal data, it's like, what is preventing that data from being used for something else, right? So one of the things that I find really encouraging is, that this idea of on-device machine learning is getting advanced more and more every year. And, I think, with that paradigm in mind, one thing we could see in the future is a machine learning system that exists entirely on your phone and isn't going into the cloud. So that data that it's collecting is actually yours. And you have it locally, so that there's no concern about somebody using it for something you're not expecting.
And you can share it when you need to, send this one bit to my doctor. Send this one bit.
Control over it.
For our most recent film, this one, Zone Out, with Thomas Middleditch did it again, and we created a version of him digitally, and then we gave it to him on a flash drive as a sort of symbolic act to be like, you should have this. In fact, everyone should. Your cookies that are following you around the internet.
I kept a copy of it. But
yeah, well, don't tell him that. The notion that the cookies that follow you around the internet can create pretty high fidelity reproductions of you, that your speaker that's listening to you all day in your house, that your phone that can hear you when it's ready for Hey Siri or OK Google is in principle able, the tools exist to make a pretty good copy of your behaviors. So, I mean, that raises for me the question of okay, we've got self-driving cars that drive like we drive. Will we have self-driving selves? Will we have versions of ourselves, as you say, that go out and be us for us? Because you're just like, oh my God, I really don't want to make this phone call. Can you go do it? And can you be charming? Because I'm tired. And it's like this other version of you is very charming and goes and gets you a job interview and succeeds. And then maybe actually I'll let it do everything. I'm just going to take my basic income, universal basic income, and it can go and have a job. I don't know. Is that, would we like that? I think quite a lot of people are like, yes, when can I get it?
Reminds me of a Bruce Willis film.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
maybe I'll make that movie. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about it.
And so what do you think needs to evolve or change for Benjamin to be able to write a full classic? Is it software? Is it hardware? Is it structural design?
So, sorry, I couldn't quite hear the question. It was what needs to change in order for Benjamin to do what?
To write a full classic.
Okay, so one of the biggest problems, in terms of like natural language generation, which is the technical term for the field that deals with generating natural language text, is long-term coherence, because we simply don't understand well enough. We don't understand language well enough to build machines yet that can generate a whole page of text that is totally coherent and human level and makes sense. We're probably at like the paragraph level right now, where we can make a paragraph that makes sense with a machine totally autonomously. But in terms of a page, in terms of a whole screenplay, it's just not there yet. I think things that will have to happen for that to become the case. I really think actually it's not so much a software problem anymore as a hardware problem, partially. The hardware keeps getting better and better, allowing for larger and larger models, but also just a design problem. I mean, if you can think of a way, and this is something that we explore a lot, is ways to sort of zoom out a level, to abstract out at one layer and think about, okay, if we can't get the machine to write a whole page of text that's coherent, how can we, generate a structure that the machine can fill in different ways. That's one approach.
It's one of the places our whole conversation began was the various people who've written theories of film structure, sort of Joseph Campbell and Sid Field and the like, who have sort of said, oh, you've got 3 acts and there's this climax here and this sort of thing. And one of the things we often discuss is like, can Benjamin's output be asked to conform to that, and what would happen if it did? Sometimes I like to call our project the Average Movie Project, because I'd like to think that eventually you would create the most average movie possible. It would be like the perfect conforming to all of the so-called rules, and it would be profoundly dull as a consequence.
But I think that, as you've discovered,
yes,
that's not really what happens when you feed a script into this machine.
Not
right?
yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
But who knows whether it ever will?
Yeah.
So I have one final. I'm getting a minute warning in the background, so I've got one final question that I'm going to ask. How long before we have an AI jury member at Cannes?
Oh.
An AI what?
And I don't mean the algorithm that sits behind the scores, but how long
AI
do you think
jury
it'll be
member,
until
not
we have
long.
a machine
Right.
learning
AI jury member?
Yeah.
jury member at
I
Cannes?
mean, it already exists. I mean,
Yes.
I don't agree with it, but
in the
it's
room.
in the room. Why would it need to be in the room?
Well,
So as an
Actually
actual
on a
jury
jury.
member,
Oh,
not
on
the
a jury.
algorithm
I
that
see what you mean.
currently
Okay.
sits behind it. We know that that's
Yeah.
been around for a while.
Well, I mean,
nobody
I'm gonna hold you
knows.
to this.
well, but I'll go so far as saying this. I think that one day it is not that unlikely, though it is not inevitable, that instead of voting in elections, we will upload models of our preferences, personalities, and behaviors that will be made into a Gestalt leader, and that will seem like the only thing that makes sense, because at the moment, democracy is like a profoundly inefficient way of achieving what it's supposed to do. You do this one blunt tool of a vote to get one person who you think will kind of agree with you to kind of do things that you would quite like them to do. And then they don't. Because of course they don't, because it doesn't make any sense. You can't boil down preferences very efficiently like that, but it's the best thing we've got. But hey, if we're boiling down human behaviors, guess what? Like, we've got a technology that's proven to be increasingly good at that.
Before we
So it
close,
wouldn't be that
Oscar,
unlikely.
that sounds terrifying, actually.
Yes, of course it does. Of
Yeah.
course it does. But it isn't that unlikely that eventually it will seem obvious.
Sure.
One of our gold pieces on the digital craft jury was Ricky Brazil. If you haven't seen it, I would definitely spend a couple of minutes checking it out. I think we're out of time, so massive, massive applause for my wonderful, wonderful panel, Ross, Kathy, and Oscar. Thank you.
Thanks.